Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. And if you're watching us on YouTube and you want to listen to us at your convenience, you can check us out wherever fine podcasts are purveyed. If you're listening to the show on a podcast platform, you can also watch us on YouTube. Please go check us out, subscribe, leave us a review, recommend us to your friends and family members. Very excited to bring our guest on. His name is Philip Howard. He's a leader in government and legal reform in the United States. He is chair of Common Good and a best-selling author. We're going to talk about one of his books. It's one of my favorites. He has advised both parties on needed reforms. In his new book, Not Accountable, he argues that public employee unions undermine democratic governance and should be rendered unconstitutional. He is the author of the best-selling book, The Death of Common Sense, published by Random House in 1995. That's a book that I read and immediately became a fan of his work. The Collapse of the Common Good in 2002. Try Common Sense, a big theme for me. His commentaries are published frequently in major media outlets. Back in 2002, he formed Common Good, a nonpartisan coalition dedicated to simplifying laws so that Americans can use common sense in daily choices. His 2010 TED Talk has been viewed by more than 750,000 people. His 2015 report, 2 Years, Not 10 Years, exposed the economic and environmental costs of delayed infrastructure approvals, and its proposals have been incorporated into federal law. Mr. Howard has appeared often on television and radio, including several times on Jon Stewart's The Daily Show. The son of a minister, Philip Howard got his start working summers at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory for the Nobel laureate Eugene Wigner. He has been active in public affairs his entire adult life. He is senior counsel at the law firm of Covington and Burling, a graduate of Yale College and the University of Virginia Law School. He lives in Manhattan with his wife, Alexandra, and they have 4 children. Philip Howard, so glad you can join us. This issue of common sense, this is something that I have pinged on a number of, pretty much almost all of my adult life, especially when working on public policy. As I said, I read your book in 1995. This certainly spurred me into that. Why has common sense died in America?
Well, I've written books about this, but basically it's one simple answer, which is after the 1960s, we tried to create a system that was better than people. We wanted law to guarantee that nothing ever went wrong with human judgment because humans are fallible. And the result is we created a system that was designed to avoid bad judgments that prevented good judgments. So teachers lost control of the classroom, and managers in the federal workforce lost control of their employees. Doctors started spending half the day filling out forms. So, people across America go through the day with their noses in rule books instead of figuring out what the right thing to do is. And so the problem isn't that everybody uses common sense. The problem is that life is complicated and you've got to give people at least the opportunity to use common sense.
Right, we've lost. I mean, we can get into Henry Silverglade's theory of 3 felonies a day and the problems that ensues there. But one of the things that I appreciate about your work is you focus on the end result of the unintended consequences, which is to say, you're right. We've taken control of the classroom away from the teacher, and as a result, we have declining test scores, or at least test scores that seem mired at very, very low standards. And yet we don't want to turn around and give teachers more control of their classrooms, or we're afraid of we've replaced learning with indoctrination, which is a whole other aspect of this. But talk about how these unintended consequences have come up and why we seem unable to change policies to reflect those unintended consequences.
Well, I think the answer to the latter part, why we don't change policies, is that inertia is very powerful, and there's a ideology behind what's happened that is basically grounded in distrust of authority, and we were right not to give unbridled discretion to authority. But to create a situation where the teacher doesn't have control of the classroom is really kind of a formula for failure. So this distrust, as the failures have mounted up over the last few decades, the distrust has become a kind of epidemic. And now America is wallowing in distrust. I mean, there's a whole industry of distrust. You know, Tucker Carlson and, you know, Donald Trump's appeal is one of resentment. And, you know, it's mainly, he says, make America great again, but it's the message is really a dark message of resentment of the things that people can't do anymore. They can't even be themselves in the office.
But right, to be fair, right? I mean, this can cut both ways. There, you know, the extremism on the left as well sort of, you know, breeds this kind of what's the word? I mean, not contempt is probably not the right word for this, but yeah.
Defund the police.
Sorry, go ahead. Right. Yeah.
You know, defund the police. Kind of radical. Radical interpretations of kind of group identity and such.
You know, I had a conversation with Donald Elliott, who was a law professor at Yale and was general counsel of the EPA. One of the things we talked about was sort of incremental change, and how when you make incremental reforms to things, you know, they tend to last longer because, you know, if you get whatever extreme comes into government as making public policy, the pendulum then swings extremely the other way, and so you get this common this constant whipsawing back and forth. Wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, I think Don Elliott's a close friend of mine. Actually, I was just talking to him today. We were classmates in college and have done a lot of work together. Well, I think there is an important role for incremental reform, but when the pendulum that he's talking about is not an operational pendulum. It's a policy pendulum where you go too far to the left, giving too many rights, for example, and then too far to the right, you know, and taking away all the rights or whatever. And so he's right about that. But I think that we're at a point where we do need a kind of a radical change in the operating machinery of government, not in policy, not in what we're, you know, not in whether we need to address climate change or whatever, but just in how things work day to day. You're never gonna, you know, there are 23 schools in Baltimore this year, apparently, where not one student is proficient in math, right? So you're never gonna fix that.
Yeah, Philip, I did radio in Baltimore for 10 years. I believe you. I know, I love where you're going with this. I'm sorry to interrupt, but go ahead.
Yeah, so you're never going to fix those schools by saying, well, let's make a little change here or there.
Sure.
You're going to have to completely change the personnel in the school, change how they interact with the students. You're going to have to figure out a way to inspire the students and the parents to get more involved in making the school better. That's not an incremental change. That's completely turning those schools upside down. Well, a version of that has to happen, I think, in many areas of government, but it's not the pendulum swinging toward left or right.
Got it,
yeah, yes. It's just making it so that people can take responsibility again.
Well, but let's talk substantively about this, because I mean, that's what the conversation is all about. What does it look like, you know, in terms of making these changes, sweeping changes to how government conducts its business? Again, Donald Elliott and I were talking about the issues of the Administrative Procedures Act and that process and the executive branch. But you're talking about a wholesale change. So let's talk about what that looks like.
Right. So there were three assumptions that of how things should work that were introduced after the 1960s. One is that we would have clear rules. So we got the idea of these, you know, I got 4,000 rules for OSHA or something. You quote clear rules, there's thick rule books that are completely incoherent to people because the mind can't keep it all straight, right? The second was the idea of having procedures where if you only had enough procedures, you could come up with the right answer. So procedures without authority. It's fine to have procedures, but you got to have authority. So you have
Sure.
these environmental review, the permitting processes like for transmission lines, that go on for 10 years. 10
Sure.
years. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
Right.
You know, I mean, environmental review, I did a study of this, and Don helped me on it a few years ago called 2 Years, Not 10 Years. Environmental reviews, in most cases now, dramatically harm the environment because they have, they block curing all the bottlenecks.
Sure.
So, and I'm sorry, and the third thing that we did was we got this idea that rights, individual rights, were not a shield against state coercion, but could be a sword against other people. Oh no, you can't tell me that I'm losing my job. That's my right. Have a job. But what if you're not doing the job and you're not pulling your weight? You know, so you have those three things going, and you can't fix anything. So I'll give an example of the other way. So recently, a section of I-95 in Philadelphia fell down because there was a truck accident underneath it and filled with gasoline, and a section of the elevated highway collapsed.
Yes.
And people said it would take months, you know, or a year to fix the damn thing, going through the procedures. Well, 13 days later, they reopened it.
Yes.
So what are the kinds of judgments that they made? First, somebody said, well, you know, if you really want to fix an elevated highway quickly, the only way to do it, because you can't order all the I-beams and all that kind of stuff in time, you know, those are long lead time items, is to do it with landfill. You know, you build up the part and then pave over it, right? But there were lots of water mains and sewer mains, and you know, 10,000 tons of landfill would have crushed it, and you couldn't do that. So somebody had the idea that let's use recycled glass. It's 1/6 the weight. Good.
Sure.
And they didn't go through any studies or anything. And then they just went and they didn't do a procurement system. They first hired a local contractor they'd worked with before on time and material basis. You know, no procurement, just, you know, existing commercial relationship.
Yeah.
Then somebody had the idea of using recycled glass. They found a recycled glass company, tried, again, entered the contract without any procurement. Trucks started coming day and night to put, you know, piles of recycled glass and they're in the highway. And then they were getting to the point where they were getting ready to pave it over, but it started raining, and you couldn't pave during wet weather and all that kind of stuff. You couldn't reopen it. So somebody had the idea of using the racetrack drying machinery from the Pocono Raceway.
Sure.
So, again, no procurement. They go out and, you know, use the judgment. Oh, I'm sorry. And during all this, there are all these permits that need to be given. So there was an official who just sit there, like from the State Department of Transportation. He just wrote out permits.
Right.
He didn't follow any of the procedures. He just gave the permits.
And he's the guy who's making sure, right, the reason why you have a permitting and procurement process is to make sure there's no graft. So he's there, you know, he can be the referee on whether or not there's graft, and you get stuff done.
Yeah, exactly. So 13 days later, it opened.
Let me put a contrast in there, Mr. Howard. So the city of Berkeley, California, for many years, the better part of a century, owned a camp up in the high Sierras. And in 2013, when there was that rim fire outside of Yosemite, the camp burned to the ground. And so that was 2013. The camp just reopened this summer, 10 years later. And again, it is because of exactly what you're talking about. And you think about a whole generation of kids that has missed out on going and getting this environmental and conservation education and the socialization of being. Of course, COVID was in there, so that, you know, they wouldn't have been able to go during COVID. But still, nevertheless, you know, you think about this. This is now not in the Berkeley camp example, but talk a little bit more in depth about when infrastructure is delayed, the environmental harms that get caused by that. Because this gets into something I talked about with Don Elliott, and so I've talked about with others. You know, the issues of risk and trade-off and the harms that get caused when you make bad policy. Talk about that.
Yeah, so there is nothing that is built that doesn't have some adverse environmental consequences.
Right.
I mean, just any human, construction does something to the environment, and so one has to accept the idea of trade-offs.
Yes.
Is nuclear power good? Well, it has lots of problems. You have disposal problems. On the other hand, it's completely carbon-free.
Right.
So are the benefits to that greater? I think so. Many people think so, but maybe the environmentalists don't. So there are all these trade-offs. Transmission lines. The environmentalists talk about renewable energy. Well, the renewable energy is in places where the energy isn't needed.
Yes.
They're in sun-baked deserts, or they're in the kind of the wind-heavy regions of the Midwest in Nebraska and Kansas. So how do you get the power from the renewable energy to the urban areas where you need it? Right. Well, that requires transmission lines.
Right.
And transmission lines are visible. Some people think if you live too close to them, it's bad for you.
Yeah.
And they may have other consequences. I mean, they're not terrible consequences, but they have consequences. Well, the permitting process for transmission lines makes it so that it is not completely, but virtually unlawful to permit a transmission line.
Wow.
And that's the only way we're going to get renewable energy.
Right.
So how is it that the environmental groups are fighting a bill that Joe Manchin had proposed that would preempt state and local permitting so that you could get one permit and build a transmission line from Kansas to Chicago?
Sure.
Why are they opposing it? Well, I can think of a couple of reasons, but the main reason they're opposing it is because they don't want to give up their veto.
Yes.
It's just a power thing. And
interesting.
So that's a problem in our society.
How much of the gridlock in Washington is rooted in this idea of people not wanting to give up their veto?
A lot.
Yeah.
How many interest groups are there in Washington? 10,000 more?
There's an interest group for every issue. So yes.
So there's a each one of them is staffed with people who keep their jobs as long as nothing changes. They're basically dedicated to the status quo. They say they're for change or for improving this or that, but they're basically there to make sure the farm subsidy stays in place, or the environmental groups keep their veto, or whatever it is. And the way Congress works is all you need is a few members of Congress, and you can't get rid of something like the 1920 Jones Act, which is completely inexcusable, which prevents shipping within the United States except on U.S. flag vessels, which I think had something the cost of double the cost of transport for oil and gas and stuff. It's really crazy. And everybody knows it's crazy. But you can't get rid of it. So as a practical matter, just flipping way ahead, if I was talking to the staff of one of the presidential candidates yesterday, and I was saying, well, one of the only realistic way of getting the budget back in order is a kind of spring cleaning commission. You can't do it incrementally because the people who want the Jones Act will get 6 or 8, they'll get contributions to 6 or 8 influential members of Congress. They won't be able to do it. So the only way to do it is to have a base closing commission type process where a base closing commission comes in and says, okay, here's a new deal that involves a spring cleaning of, pick it, 200 programs that everybody knows are obsolete. This will have benefits as well as costs to everybody. So here you are, Congress, vote it up or down. And that's the only way it's ever going to happen. Because if you try to do it incrementally in backroom deals, every single reform gets stopped.
Well, that gets into, sort of changing the inertia within the agencies themselves, right? And this is part of what gets into what you're talking about in terms of the the government employee unions. And I want you to touch on that as we talk about this. But when you have government agencies in which every employee has their own sort of parochial interest and they want to build their own sort of empire, actually, let's not even call it empire, but their portfolios. They want to maintain their portfolios.
Right.
They don't want to see that agency size reduced. Talk about that and talk about the role of government employee unions and how they play into this.
Right. So it's really important not only to deal with the issues that you and I were talking about, which is the sort of sediment in the harbor, the sort of going, of the accretion of laws and regulations and such that. But it's also important to be able to manage daily operations. And so what happened in government in the 1960s is that, and then it was enshrined in the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, is that we gave collective bargaining power to public employees. And the effect of that was to make a problem into a worse problem, which is the problem of public accountability generally. So it's basically impossible to get rid of to fire
career civil servant,
job. Yeah, you just can't do it. I mean, 99% of federal employees get a fully successful rating. Unless you commit a crime or say something politically incorrect, you can't lose your job. So what's the effect of that? The effect of that is not that most federal employees are bad people. Most federal employees are good people. They're in government because they want to serve the public. The effect is it's very hard to have the mutual trust needed for an energetic enterprise when you know that performance doesn't matter.
Sure.
And the Volcker commissions talked about that. They said it's really important to overhaul civil service because it's discouraging to everybody when they see people around them not doing the job.
Right.
Another effect of it is that politics doesn't matter if the civil service can just wait out the elected official. Right? It's the weeby wig, kind of phenomenon. We'll be here when you're gone.
That's right.
So it's really important if you want democracy to work. Democracy is just a process of accountability. You elect people. If they do a lousy job, you elect somebody else. It's very important to have accountability down the line. And Madison talked about it during the constitutional debates and such, the importance of unbroken chain of accountability. And it doesn't mean that people should be fired if they don't believe in if they believe in climate change,
either way, if they believe in climate change or don't believe in climate change, right?
But so you can have a speed bump in there to protect against arbitrary firings, but you can't make somebody prove who has bad judgment or who doesn't cooperate. You just can't do that in a legal hearing.
Right.
That's not what law is about. It's about judgments. And so you've got to restore to senior supervisors in the federal government, like the members of the SES, Senior Executive Service and such. You have to restore to them the authority to do their jobs.
Right. It's we had a conversation with David Bernhardt, who has the distinction of being the only person to ever serve as solicitor and then assistant secretary of the interior and then secretary of the interior. He's just recently written a book on this issue, and
you report to me.
You report to me. Which is admittedly a heavy-handed way of sort of saying this, but the idea is elections have consequences, and agency priorities change.
Sure.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the concept of responsibility is meaningless if the person doesn't have the authority that goes along with that.
Right. And if employees are working at cross purposes, again, right? It's not even set aside the partisan aspect of it. Well, let's get back to the aspect of democracy. People voted an administration in. They obviously voted that administration in for a lot of reasons, but among things is because they want to see what that administration does. If that administration doesn't have the ability to make the changes that they've promised, then what purpose is there of having the elections? I think you've just said this, and I've just repeated it back to you. So I mean, but am I on the right trail here?
Oh yeah, completely. So
yeah.
So I have a book out this year called Not Accountable, where I argue that giving collective bargaining power to public employee unions should be unconstitutional, because we've created because you've basically put a blockade into the main operating lever of democracy. You elect people to run the government who don't have the authority to run the government because of these collective bargaining agreements. You elect a mayor, for example, who comes into office in Baltimore.
Right, perfect
and
example.
And he has no authority to change any personnel in any of those broken schools. Right. No authority.
Yes.
He has no authority. George Floyd was killed by a cop called Derek Chauvin. Derek Chauvin was a weird guy, probably shouldn't have been on the streets with a deadly weapon. The police chief had no authority to terminate him or even to reassign him.
Right.
Under
this
the
is a problem.
Collective bargaining agreement.
Right. I mean, it's a situation in Baltimore where, and we could talk about competition of ideas again, sort of talking about the common good. There is no real competition for ideas, so there aren't a lot of real choices. To come back to the Baltimore example, because I think you're correct that they don't need incremental change, and incremental change will take just too long. But if the electorate in Baltimore isn't willing to make the sweeping changes that need to be made, or they don't elect a mayor who's willing to do it, or a city council that's willing to do it, what happens then? What are we left with?
Well, first of all, if people understood this problem and they made the choice to have a paralytic government where everything fails and costs a lot of money, then the people make that choice, right?
Sure.
Yes. And democracy does have the problem identified years ago by the ancient philosopher Polybius, is that people can buy votes.
Mm-hmm.
If politicians can buy votes, and essentially, even though there's no money to pay for it.
Sure.
They can.
That's interesting.
And so there is this tendency of democracies to kind of go bankrupt because people get elected by promising more and promising never to take anything away. So you do have a general problem with democracy that way. But in America today, you have campaigns where people run for office promising change we can believe in, or drain the swamp, or whatever, without ever actually articulating or really even understanding by these politicians that the operating machinery doesn't actually give anybody the authority to do those things. Well, so that it is illegal to have change you can believe in. It is illegal to give a permit for a transmission line. It is illegal to have an energetic department because you can't get rid of the person who everybody can't stand.
Yeah.
It's illegal to fix a bad school. So we need to articulate the fact that you need to have an operating system where people have authority before you can blame it on democracy.
Right. It's interesting because, again, one of the perennial problems, schools are out of session right now. If schools were in session, today, as we're recording this, it's supposed to be one of the hottest days of the year in D.C., certainly in Baltimore. The perennial problem in Baltimore is no air conditioning in schools. Why they can't solve this problem, I don't understand. But here we are, 10 years since I've started doing radio in Baltimore. It's always been a problem there. Let me sort of turn our attention to governance generally and the relationship between the two parties. You wrote The Death of Common Sense in 1995. Obviously, you were interested and involved in these issues beforehand. One of my theories is, this is why I'm going to present this to you. One of my theories is that one of the problems we have in America is that nobody it's not only that nobody is willing to admit that they made a mistake or that they made a policy decision that was wrong, but if you admit that you made a wrong choice or that you were wrong on something, there is no forgiveness. There's no ability to forgive. Someone is always there to essentially hold it over your head. Has part of what we lost here is the ability to forgive people for being wrong or allowing people to admit that they're wrong?
Yes, clearly. And I think that's partially a leadership problem, but it also feeds into what I was referring to as this sort of culture of distrust.
Yes.
Everyone, we now have a public culture in which people relish error.
Oh, yes.
They relish being able to say someone did something wrong. It's not about results. It's about finger pointing and Schadenfreude and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So we have a public culture that's really aimed at failure, and of course it's self-fulfilling, because if you don't trust anybody, you don't let them make a decision, then it's going to fail, right?
Right.
So the school's never going to get fixed because you don't let anybody try to fix it. And
are you familiar with the term hot take? The idea is that a hot take is an immediate reaction, and it's the most outrageous. The word that they also use in social media circles is own, when you own somebody else, owning the right, owning the left. So a hot take is an immediate reaction to something that is supposed to own your opponent. And I think that has also led to this collapse of society, right? Because we no longer can have a discussion because everybody's trying to have the hottest of the hot takes.
I see.
And they're rewarded for the hottest of the hot takes. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, that sounds right. I mean, Donald Trump's sort of brilliant at that, right? I mean, Donald Trump has a feral instinct for the punchback.
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
somebody does something, he punches right back. He's really fantastic at it. It doesn't have anything to do with being able to govern or even understanding government. It's just it's just a debating technique. He's just good at it. He's very good at the rejoinder.
Right, and when you bait somebody and you go down that road of baiting somebody as opposed to debating somebody, it is impossible to have any kind of come to a common agreement, which is part of what you guys do at the Common Good, is try to find common ground on things.
Well, yes, that's right, but I don't believe in consensus either. I think that we're really interested in operations. How do you make something work?
Okay.
So the way we look at it is that we don't have a system. You look at test scores, you look at metrics. We're the opposite of that.
Okay.
Our idea is only that you've got to give people the freedom to adapt. You've got to give freedom to engage in trial and error. You've got to give people the chance to do it in their own ways. You want to inspire students, you've got to give teachers the freedom to be inspirational. You can't tell them how to teach.
Right. It's the issue of empowerment versus disempowerment, which is also a theme on a lot of these conversations. How do you empower people to act in their own stead, in their own betterment?
Right. So I'm just finishing a very short book that'll be published in January.
Excellent.
That's called Everyday Freedom.
Okay.
And it basically argues that we will never get over the epidemic of alienation, much less fix government, until we give back to people to the freedom, we empower them to take responsibility again.
Sure.
And to get along or not get along with people, to do their jobs or not do their jobs and get fired. We've got to give everybody at every level of responsibility back the ability to be themselves. I mean, in America today, the national motto shouldn't be whatever it is, the pluribus unum. It ought to be, don't be yourself. Don't ever be spontaneous. Don't ever tell a joke.
Sure.
Don't ever do it your way. Just follow it. Sure. Just go by the book.
This is a conversation we had. We had Bob Levy formerly of the Washington Post on, and we talked about free speech and free expression and the real danger there. People, people, we should want people to speak their minds, for very least so that we know, I don't like what that guy has to say, so I'm gonna stay away from him. Or we hold up his bad idea or her bad idea to scrutiny, and we have a full-on discussion about this. Let me posit something to you for a moment, Mr. Howard, because this came up again on social media, somebody's hottest of hot takes. Does government fail because we don't give government enough resources to solve the problems that we're trying to get government to solve?
Not in this country, no. No.
Okay.
No, we don't give officials. Government fails because we don't give officials the authority that goes with their responsibility.
Nice. Okay.
And we don't hold them accountable. We have, take schools.
Yes.
I think in New York City, they're spending $38,000 per student in a school.
Right.
And the charter schools would spend, maybe 50 or 60% of that, perform dramatically better. Well, why is that?
Right.
It's because the people in the public schools don't have the authority to manage them.
Right. And
So-
there's no accountability to deal with
well, that's
the
the main
teachers that don't
management
teach.
tool. Yeah,
Right,
that's right.
right.
I had to, during the budget deficit ceiling thing, I had a column in the Hill saying, look, everybody knows, all you have to do is look at 10 years of GAO reports, and you can find hundreds of billions of dollars to save every year.
Yes.
Just look at the GAO reports. This is not rocket science. They tell you that there are 150 teacher training programs with no evidence that any of them work. They will tell you, that there's all this stuff that's like the Jones Act or other things that make no sense. So it's, we need a spring cleaning. We don't need more resources. We need a spring cleaning, and that'll free up a lot of resources.
Would some of this, I've got a colleague, he edits Real Clear Policy, his name's Jerry Rogers. He talks about the return to regular order in Congress. Would some of this also be solved by a return to regular order and having that thorough vetting in these committees? And I'm sorry, as a corollary to this, because I talked about this with Donald Elliott, we also have we now have a Congress that is essentially fully staffed by, people who have no knowledge of the substantive issues on which they're working on. In fact, they have very little experience in anything at all. That's part of the problem. I'm sorry, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so I don't, I'll talk about Congress. There are a lot of problems with Congress, and a return to regular order would be actually quite good. A return to a party system that had party bosses that actually could make some judgments would also be a good thing. But the main failure of government is in its operating machinery that is not manageable, not accountable, and wasteful. The role of Congress should be in part to fix that, right?
Sure.
As well as to, I had a book called The Rule of Nobody where I proposed 7 constitutional amendments, one of which was to give Congress much more authority to veto agency regulations that it didn't like.
The REINS Act,
So they
that
had
kind of
more,
thing. Yes.
Without presentment to the president, which it requires now. So Congress delegated lawmaking to the agencies, and in my view, should be able to take it back if they don't like the thing. I also had a proposal because the founders made a mistake. They made it hard to enact laws on the theory that would, mean that you didn't have too many busybody Congresses, right?
Sure.
But they didn't put in a provision on how to get rid of laws.
Yes.
And so it's the same procedure, except now there's a vested interest, the Jones Act interest group or whatever, dedicated to preventing getting rid of it. So I also proposed a protocol, it wouldn't be a constitutional amendment, where Congress could agree that any committee, could amend a law, and everyone else would agree to vote for that amendment, just as a matter of form, without any debate.
Okay.
If Both the majority and minority leaders of both houses agreed with it. So you've got the minority and majority, and some supermajority of the committee voted for it, 2/3 or something. So then you would have a practical mechanism to amend laws. There's not one law that isn't broken. There isn't one law that doesn't have lots of unforeseen consequences. All of them need to be amended just because life's too complex. You can't write a law and have it work the way you want it. So why not give back to committees a real authority? And if you can agree on a bipartisan basis within a committee that something should be amended, everybody else should vote for it. I mean, you could really clean out the stables doing that.
Listen, as someone who spends his non-broadcast career dealing with the regulatory state, that is something that is incredibly intriguing to me. So I appreciate that. Great. Let's take a step back there, Philip Howard, and let's talk a little bit about how you got interested in these things. How did you come to start doing this work?
Yes, exactly. I'm a glutton for punishment.
Yeah.
I was always interested in public policy, and when I was in college, I was the gopher for a Nobel Prize winner named Eugene Wigner at the Oak Ridge National Lab.
Oh, yes.
And I ended up publishing papers on post-nuclear war recovery as a teenager.
Wow.
So I had this incredibly lucky, kind of mentor and policy upbringing. And I kind of learned through that and other things to, I think the main thing I learned is to think things through by myself, to listen to other people, but not to just defer to whatever the ideological status quo is, just because people say that's the way it should be. And I couldn't see a career that I wanted in public service because I didn't want to work for some asshole. So I, so I became a lawyer, like everybody, like many of my friends.
Sure.
And then a civic leader in New York. But I was very active as a civic leader, and my friends in government kept telling me about their frustrations of not being able to do what they thought was right. And that got me thinking about it. This was over 30 years ago. And so I hired the brother of a friend of mine who is an intellectual historian at Claremont. I hired him to give me a tutorial in political philosophy for a year.
Nice. Excellent.
I mean, I wasn't going to write a book. I was just curious.
Yeah.
I said, well, why do we have this stupid system where the people who supposedly have official responsibility can't do what they think is right? It just didn't make any sense to me. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that everything I'd learned in law school about how law should work, or a lot of it, was wrong.
Interesting.
That we had created a kind of a legal structure after the 60s that didn't accord with any sensible or philosophical vision of how governance should work. So that became the death of common sense.
Let me ask you this before I let you go. Listening as a core value, right? Again, as we sort of, and again, I know we're not talking about consensus work here. We're talking about making decisions and letting people have the freedom to make decisions. But in terms of getting things done, right? One of the problems, of course, in an environment where the majority leaders or the majority and minority leaders of the two parties have to agree on something is that we live in an environment now where they're not allowed to agree. But let's talk about, I grew up in New York. I went to the Fieldston School up in the Bronx. Listening to me was taught as a core value. How important is listening in 2023?
Oh, it's really important, obviously.
Yeah.
And because everyone has a different point of view. Every husband and wife learns that very quickly. And so, one of the things that Yuval Levin writes about, Tim Carney's also written about it, is the disappearance of community institutions, of institutional authority, where people in the community get together, for example, to try to deal with the homeless problem.
Sure.
We've got big government and government officials doing it, and then we've got radicalized individuals on the bottom saying, give me my rights or something. But you don't have people in the middle saying, you know, how can we solve this problem? What do you think? What do you think?
Yeah.
You know, and so it's those situations that where people realize the importance of listening.
Yes.
Because you've got to work it out together in the community. And so everything in Congress, all these disagreements that people are having are disagreements over abstractions.
Yes.
You know, I don't believe in government, or I do believe in government, or whatever. You know?
Right.
But they're not really making practical. They're not having practical discussions. Well, governance is a practical art. You know, it's an activity where there are different ways to do things. You try it doesn't work. Try something else, and you do have to listen. And instead,
I'll give you a quick example. You know, you've got Donald Elliott's wife, Dr. Gail Charnley. You know, she's a toxicologist. She wrote a really great op-ed recently about the EPA is working to essentially, they're not saying they're banning it, but they're working to essentially ban a chemical called ethylene oxide. Now, ethylene oxide is used as a disinfectant in the medical world that disinfects about half of all medical devices and tools that are used. You can't have a surgery in America without having at least one tool in that surgical theater that is disinfected with ethylene oxide. But nobody thought to go and check with the FDA and about the fact that there's no ready substitute for ethylene oxide. And so we're faced with this situation. I guess the reason I bring this up is, you know, we're not talking. We people make pronouncements about things. Right. Ethylene oxide is bad, therefore we ought to do something about it, without thinking, well, wait a minute, there's a reason why we use this, and we don't have a substitute. So maybe we ought to not ban it, at least not until we have some alternative.
You ought to slow down and put control there.
Yeah.
There was a quote that I read somewhere that was attributed to a 19th century historian called Henry Buckle, who was famous in his day. There was something like this: the truth of any matter lies not at its center, but at the edges where it intersects with all other matters.
Interesting. I like that.
So, yeah. So, you know, and so the ethylene oxide thing is like that. Yes, it's toxic.
Yes.
But it also saves a lot of lives by disinfecting, instruments. So the truth is the truth is in the middle, and that goes to your point about listening.
Yeah, we have to. Well, I think we should leave it there. Philip Howard, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Yeah, great to be with you, Andrew.
Go and check out his books. He's got a new one coming out in January. I look forward to reading that. I want to thank you all for joining me on the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm Andrew Langer, your host. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream